The choice of ministers is of no small importance to the prince. They are good or not according to the prudence of the prince. And the first conjecture that is to be made of the brain of a lord is to see the men he has around him. And when they are capable and faithful, he can always be reputed wise, because he has known how to recognize them as capable and to maintain them as faithful. One of the primary challenges of reading the prince is to figure out how to deal with its inconsistencies, its tensions, and its contradictions. Which of Machiavelli's claims are we to take at face value? Which ones are ironic, cynical, or hyperbolic? And which ones are perhaps specifically targeted at various potential audiences? A good place to start this kind of inquiry is chapter 22, which is where Machiavelli speaks of those whom princes have as secretaries. Given Machiavelli's biography, his own service as Florentine secretary during Soderini's Republic, and his expressed interest in returning and resuming this political work under the Medici, we should expect to learn something important from Machiavelli about secretaries. The first impression a prince makes, Machiavelli says, is through the quality of his advisors. If Machiavelli says they are capable and faithful, the prince will gain a reputation for being wise. Wisdom, we may infer, has two components. One is the capacity to recognize talent. The other is the ability to keep one's advisors loyal and faithful. Wisdom then involves being perceptive, but also skillful. Perceptive in one's ability to identify a good advisor, and skillful in maintaining that advisor's loyalty. Let us reflect on each of these components in turn. First, perceptiveness. Machiavelli writes in this very same chapters, there are three kinds of brains. One that understands by itself, another that discerns what others understand, the third that understands neither by itself nor through others. The first is most excellent, the second excellent, and the third useless. So we have three kinds of brains between which Machiavelli distinguishes. The first understands by itself, which he calls the most excellent one. The second, the excellent one, discerns what others understand. And the third doesn't understand at all and is accordingly useless. Now, if the prince is perceptive enough to pick a good advisor, he must have either an excellent or a most excellent brain. Yet, if Machiavelli's princely reader had a most excellent brain, he wouldn't need Machiavelli's advice and he wouldn't be reading The Prince. Hence, we can infer that Machiavelli expects his reader to have the second kind of brain, the one that discerns what others understand. By calling it excellent rather than, say, ordinary or mediocre, Machiavelli avoids insulting the reader. A good advisor, we can infer, has the most excellent kind of brain. He must, after all, advise princes on matters which the prince's brain does not by itself autonomously and immediately understand. The implication here, of course, is that Machiavelli himself has a most excellent kind of brain. Why otherwise would we, who at best have the middle kind of brains, be reading his work? The classification schema of brains is adapted from Livy. Book 22 of the History of Rome recounts the rivalry of two Roman politicians, Fabius Maximus and Marcus Minucius, during Rome's war against Hannibal. It took a near defeat of his troops by Hannibal for Minucius to acknowledge Fabius as the better military strategist. When he finally does so, he rationalizes his concession to his soldiers by distinguishing between three kinds of men. The best man, who can give good counsel, the next best, who is ready to obey the good counsel of another, and the fool, who is too ignorant to do either. For Livy, then, the three-brain schema is a way for leaders to gracefully justify taking counsel from others. Machiavelli picks this up, but turns it into a question of glory, with the somewhat dubious suggestion that having exceptional advisors may be a source of glory for the prince. Now, the second dimension of wisdom, the ability to keep one's advisors faithful, is the subject of the second part of chapter 22. So let's go back to the text. But as to how a prince can know his minister, here is a mode that never fails. When you see a minister thinking more of himself than of you, and in all actions looking for something useful to himself, one so made will never be a good minister. Never will you be able to trust him, because he who has someone's state in his hands should never think of himself, but always of the prince. And he should never remember anything that does not pertain to the prince. So in this chapter, Machiavelli offers a simple rule. You cannot trust an advisor who thinks more of himself than of you. At first sight, this seems a rather straightforward criterion for assessing one's ministers. But on second thought, the simplicity is perhaps deceptive. Given the moral psychology Machiavelli puts forward in The Prince, on what grounds would we expect secretaries to rank the prince's interest over theirs? On what grounds would we expect advisors to be selfless and altruistic? If the desire to conquer, as chapter 3 points out, is a natural and ordinary thing, why would we expect secretaries to be less interested in conquest than princes? What about the advice in chapter 19 that the prince be a great pretender and dissembler, and that it is not necessary for princes to be virtuous as long as they seem virtuous? Doesn't the same hold for secretaries? Given that secretaries have a most excellent brain compared to the prince's at best mediocre one, wouldn't we expect secretaries to be more skillful in those respects and hence be able to fool the prince? If so, can we really expect princes to identify true fidelity? How would a prince distinguish between genuine and fake loyalty? Can we expect princes to be able to identify the conditions under which their secretaries prioritize their interest more so than the prince's? It seems to me that the message of chapter 22 is that secretaries will pursue their interests no matter what, and the princes are in no position to stop them. In fact, they're not even in a position to notice. What then is the purpose of this chapter? Let me sketch three possible interpretations. The first one is that the chapter may simply be intended to deceive anxious princes and to make them believe that employing advisors is a safe course of action. Such anxiety was historically well-founded. After all of Machiavelli's contemporaries would have been familiar with the example of Francesco Sforza, the condottiere who was hired as a mercenary captain by the Duchy of Milan and who made himself Duke of Milan in 1450. Machiavelli cites Sforza repeatedly and approvingly in The Prince as someone who rose to power based on his own virtue and his own arms. And chapter 22 may thus be a way to assuage the fears of potential princes or actual princes as to employing advisors. The second interpretation is a variation on the first. The chapter could be intended not only to allay the fears of princes, but also it could have an additional oblique audience, namely the advisors themselves. And these advisors are, in a backhanded way, counseled to hide their true intentions and their true projects and pretend that their interests align perfectly with those of the prince. This, of course, again raises the question of why advisors would need such counsel, given that ex hypothesi they are endowed with the most excellent brains, the kinds that understand on their own and do not read Machiavelli's book. So this brings us to the third possible reading, and that would be a rhetorical one. What if the ostensibly simple rule that you can only trust a selfless advisor is a rhetorical exercise? That is, an exercise in practical reasoning of the kind that were typical for humanist Renaissance culture. Thus, the second part of chapter 22 might be understood as a dramatic test of the reader's reasoning capacity, as in, have you readers really understood the lessons of the previous 21 chapters? The reader who accepts Machiavelli's claim that there is a simple rule and princes can trust advisors who prioritize their interest over their master's welfare over their own, demonstrates a failure of independent reasoning. Such a failure is evidence of, at best, the mediocre type of brain, i.e. the one that can grasp what others understand but can't really think on its own. The passage thus illustrates both why princes need advisors and the dangers these advisors pose for princes who lack the capacity to think on their own. The humanist practice of imitation is an important resource, yet what defines political skill is the ability to think through both sides of a question, to think, as it were, dialectically, and to acknowledge and recognize the tensions and contradictions inherent in a political situation. That ultimately is what makes the most excellent kind of brain.